There is a city in Texas, 35 miles from Dallas, that has spent more than a century actively refusing to be Dallas, leaning instead into brick streets, cattle pens, and a nickname its residents wear with genuine pride, Cowtown, Fort Worth. Population 970,000. Founded as a military outpost on the Trinity River in 1849, transformed by its position on the Chisholm Trail into one of the largest livestock markets in American history, and still, to this day, the only city in the country that runs an actual cattle drive down a public street twice a day, every day, simply because that's what the street was originally built for. Fort Worth. Where the West didn't end, it just got a steakhouse. In 1911, a young woman named Jesusa, known for the rest of her life simply as Mama Suez, immigrated from Michoacan, Mexico to Fort Worth. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1930, she and her husband Joe T. Garcia began selling sandwiches, barbecue, and home-cooked Mexican dishes out of a small neighborhood grocery store called Comercial de Tafola in the city's North Side neighborhood. Among the customers who reportedly stopped in for barbecue sandwiches and bread during this period, the outlaws Bonnie and Clyde, then actively running from the law across Texas and the Midwest. On July 4, 1935, Joe and Jesse opened the doors of what they called Joe's Place, a 16-seat restaurant run entirely by the couple and their 5 children. Mama Suez's enchiladas and handmade tortillas became so popular that customers waited outside for hours just to get a table. When Joe died unexpectedly in 1953, Mama Suez, an immigrant woman navigating a business world that gave her little room to operate in, kept the restaurant running, eventually bringing her daughters Mary and Hope into the operation and renaming it Joe T. Garcia's Mexican Dishes. The restaurant has now operated continuously for 90 years, expanded from its original single room into a building that encompasses most of a city block, with a lush garden patio of towering palms and fountains that can seat roughly 2,000 customers on a single weekend. It sits just a few blocks from the Fort Worth stockyards, and its guest book reads like a Texas celebrity index. George W. Bush, Willie Nelson, Leon Bridges, Julia Roberts, Harrison Ford, Hugh Jackman, and Henry Kissinger, who once visited alongside Fort Worth billionaire Sid Bass, have all eaten enchiladas at the same tables where Mama Suez once fed an entire neighborhood out of a converted grocery store. In 1947, in the heart of the Fort Worth stockyards, a couple opened a steakhouse inside the same building that housed their insurance business. Early newspaper advertisements for the restaurant in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram promised customers refrigerated air, genuinely novel for the era, alongside Sunday dollar dinners, and listed without any particular fanfare, calf and lamb fries. Calf fries, the Texas euphemism for breaded, deep-fried bull or calf testicles, exist because cattle ranching has always generated them as a practical byproduct. Young bulls not destined for breeding are castrated during roundups to fatten more efficiently, and a working ranching economy doesn't waste usable protein. Cattlemen's put them on the menu from day one, treating them as an ordinary regional specialty rather than a novelty, which, in a city built entirely around the cattle trade, is exactly what they were. Nearly 80 years later, Cattleman's Steakhouse remains a stockyards institution, having fed ranchers, rodeo regulars, tourists, and politicians continuously through decades of change, a pandemic, and the general churn that claims most restaurants of its age. A 2025 ownership change brought in executive chef Theodore Tom, previously of the Wynn Las Vegas, to oversee a multi-million-dollar renovation. Proof that even Fort Worth's oldest cowboy steakhouse occasionally needs an upgrade, even as the giant illuminated cattle sign over its North Main Street entrance has stayed exactly where it's always been. In 1866, Fort Worth became a critical waypoint on the Chisholm Trail, the loosely defined route that cattle drovers used to move longhorns from Texas ranches north to railheads in Kansas. A typical drive could involve 1,500 to 2,500 head of cattle and take 2 to 6 months. Fort Worth became the place where exhausted cowboys could rest, resupply, and prepare for the brutal stretch still ahead. Everything changed in 1876 when the Texas and Pacific Railway reached the city, making it possible to ship cattle to market directly from Fort Worth rather than driving them the entire distance overland. The Union Stockyards Company formed in 1887. By 1893, Boston investor Greenleaf Simpson had purchased and renamed the operation the Fort Worth Stockyards Company. Major meatpacking plants from Armour and Company and Swift and Company opened in 1902, and the Livestock Exchange Building that same era, quickly nicknamed the Wall Street of the West, became the administrative and financial nerve center for an industry that, at its peak around 1904, made Fort Worth the fifth largest livestock market in the entire country. The stockyards declined through the mid-20th century as trucking and decentralized regional auctions changed how cattle moved to market. But a major 1970s preservation effort, leading to the district's 1976 listing on the National Register of Historic Places, saved the brick streets and historic buildings from demolition. Underneath Joe T. Garcia's enchiladas and underneath nearly every Tex-Mex menu across Fort Worth sits the same foundation found across the rest of Texas. A cuisine built by Tejano families, Texans of Mexican descent whose communities predate the state of Texas itself, adapted over generations through contact with American ingredients, railroad-era trade, and the specific culinary traditions that immigrant families like the Garcias carried north from interior Mexican states. Fort Worth's particular spin on the genre leans heavily on its cattle-town identity. Combo fajita platters, built around the same beef the stockyards made the city famous for, chile rellenos stuffed and fried the traditional way, and enchiladas built from slow-cooked meat and secret gravy recipes, Mama Suez's own term for her sauce, that her family has never published. Billed as the world's largest honky-tonk, Billy Bob's Texas opened inside a former stockyards livestock barn and has hosted country music legends, indoor bull riding, and a kitchen built specifically to feed a crowd that's there for music first and food second, but expects the food to actually hold up. The Honky Tonk Kitchen serves the bar food backbone of Texas nightlife: smoked brisket sandwiches, chicken fried steak, jalapeno poppers, and the kind of hearty, fast turnaround plates designed to fuel a night of two-stepping rather than a leisurely sit-down dinner. It's less a culinary destination in its own right than a reflection of what an entire night out in the stockyards actually requires. Food sturdy enough to share a table with a long-neck beer and a country band. Chicken fried steak occupies the same essential position in Fort Worth that it does across the rest of Texas and Oklahoma. A beef cutlet, pounded thin, dredged in seasoned flour, fried until the crust crackles like fried chicken, and smothered in white cream gravy alongside mashed potatoes. What distinguishes Fort Worth's relationship to the dish isn't a unique invention story. The dish's exact origins remain genuinely disputed among German and Czech immigrant communities across central Texas. But the sheer density of Cattletown steakhouses and diners built specifically to serve it well, treating it as a baseline test of a kitchen's competence the same way a diner judges a city's pizza by its first slice. In a city built entirely on cattle, a properly made chicken fried steak isn't a novelty item. It's table stakes. Fort Worth sits close enough to the Central Texas barbecue belt, the German and Czech meat market tradition running through Lockhart, Luling, and the Hill Country, that smoked brisket has become as central to the city's identity as its cattle trade history would suggest. Fort Worth's own barbecue scene, anchored by stockyards area pits and a growing roster of newer smokehouses across the city, follows the same essential Central Texas logic. Brisket rubbed simply with salt and pepper, smoked low and slow over post oak for upward of 12 hours, sliced and served on butcher paper rather than buried in sauce. The city's proximity to the ranching operations that supply the beef gives Fort Worth pitmasters a specific advantage, and a specific point of local pride that a city further from cattle country simply doesn't have built into its supply chain. Cowtown Coliseum, built in 1908 inside the Stockyards District, hosted the world's first indoor rodeo in 1918, a genuine innovation at a time when rodeo events were exclusively outdoor, weather-dependent affairs. The Coliseum still runs regular rodeo events today, and the food culture that surrounds Fort Worth's rodeo scene traces directly back to the chuck wagon cooking that fed actual working cowboys on the Chisholm Trail a century and a half ago. Chuck wagon cooking, beans, biscuits, beef stewed or smoked over an open campfire, coffee boiled strong enough to stand a horseshoe in, was built entirely around portability and the limited ingredients a trail cook could carry on a wagon for months at a time. Fort Worth's rodeo concessions and Western-themed restaurants throughout the stockyards lean directly on that imagery and that flavor profile. Simple, hearty, beef-forward food built to fuel actual physical labor, repackaged today for tourists watching bull riding rather than cowboys driving cattle to Kansas. Frito pie, corn chips topped with chili, cheese, and onion, traditionally served directly in the bag the chips came in, is claimed by multiple Texas cities, but Fort Worth's Tex-Mex restaurants and Stockyards concession stands serve it with the same casual confidence found across the rest of the state. As a fast, cheap, satisfying combination of two ingredients, Texas chili and a bag of corn chips, that needed remarkably little invention to become beloved. The dish's appeal in a cattle town specifically tracks with everything else on this list. Beef-based chili, served without ceremony, designed to be eaten standing up at a rodeo or a stockyard street fair rather than at a sit-down table. Fort Worth built its entire food identity around refusing to let the cattle trade become a museum piece. Most American cities that built fortunes on 19th-century livestock markets eventually let those industries fade into historical plaques and renamed streets. Fort Worth runs an actual twice-daily cattle drive down a real public street, every single day except 3 holidays a year, because the stockyards never fully stopped being what they originally were. Cattleman's Steakhouse listed calf fries on its very first 1947 newspaper ad with the same casual tone it used to advertise air conditioning, not as a novelty, but as Sunday dinner. Joe T. Garcia's grew from a 16-seat family operation run by an immigrant woman who outlived her husband and built an empire anyway, into a 2,000-seat institution that's fed presidents and outlaws alike. Not every city's most famous restaurant once fed Bonnie and Clyde during the same decade it was feeding its own neighborhood out of a converted grocery store. Not every city still runs a 19th-century commercial activity down its main street twice a day for free, purely because the brick was already there. Not every city's steakhouse menu has treated bull testicles as an unremarkable side dish for nearly 80 consecutive years.